Good evening. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on October 5th, 2024. In January of this year, Canada's two main spy agencies were rebuked by the Federal Court of Canada for failing to keep judges informed on how they handle Canadians' identifying information. At issue was the disclosure of identifying information about Canadians given to CSIS by the Communications Security Establishment, Canada's electronic intelligence agency. The court confirmed the findings by a national security review body that the CSE disclosed, quote, identifying, close quote, information to CSIS contrary to restrictions imposed by the federal court, which grants CSIS warrants for intelligence gathering. The court stated, quote, CSIS's failure to live up to its obligations in this regard appears to have been an institutional failing, rather than a failing of any particular individual or individuals. This failing goes to the heart of CSIS's relationship with the court. It is a matter of institutional trust. It is incumbent upon CSIS to continue its recent efforts to do better. Close quote. Some would question whether, in fact, CSIS is genuinely trying to do better. The court found that CSIS was receiving identifying personal information about Canadians, failed to inform the federal court, and only fessed up after the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency flagged the issue. According to the ruling, CSIS identified 159 instances of violating warrant conditions when it came to Canadians identifying information between April 2021 and June 2022. So that's a period of approximately 15, 16 months. Now, Section 16 of the CSIS Act states that subject to this section, the service may, in relation to the defense of Canada or the conduct of the international affairs of Canada, assist the Minister of National Defense or the Minister of Foreign Affairs within Canada in the collection of information or intelligence relating to the capabilities, intentions, or activities of A, any foreign state or group of foreign states, or B, any person other than a Canadian citizen, a permanent resident within the meaning of subsection 2.1 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, and a corporation incorporated by or under an act of parliament or of the legislature of a province. In its decision of January of this year, the court pointed out that in Section 16 warrants, CSIS is, quote, prohibited from collecting information or intelligence relating to the capabilities, intentions, or activities of Canadians, except insofar as such information may be incidentally collected through the exercise of warranted powers against non-Canadians. Now, this decision was by no means the first time that CSIS was found to have been dishonest with the court. Instead, the decision in January is part of a long line of cases that have raised serious questions about the agency's compliance with the laws governing its activities. Now, new questions have been raised by an incident that occurred at Toronto's International Airport this past week. Tamara Lorincz, a peace activist who was returning from a peace conference in Russia, was questioned extensively by a CSIS agent at Toronto's Pearson Airport. The agent made some very troubling statements to her in the course of that interrogation. Tamara is joining me today to discuss what happened. She's a PhD candidate in global governance at the Balsillie School for International Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University in the province of Ontario, Canada. She was awarded the Rotary International World Peace Fellowship and was a senior researcher for the International Peace Bureau in Switzerland. And she's a member of the Canadian Pugwash Group, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Thank you for joining me today, Tamara.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for having me.
And just in the interest of full disclosure, I consider Tamara to be not only a fellow peace activist and a colleague in various endeavors relating to peace, but also a friend. I've known Tamara for years and have been involved in a number of events targeting, peacefully, of course, members of the Trudeau government or other government officials who are complicit in various international legal violations, in our view, including most recently at the University of Ottawa, when Bob Rae, Canada's UN ambassador, gave a, in my opinion, laughable speech claiming that Canada's foreign policy is principled. In any case, Tamara, why don't we start by, if you could just start by briefly explaining what you were doing in Russia in the days or week or two leading up to your interaction with the CSIS agent in Toronto.
So I went to Russia for 2 weeks from mid-September till October 2nd. I was invited to attend the Eurasian Women's Forum, which is a high-level conference that 126 countries were represented. Approximately 2,000 women, from these countries were at this important forum. The theme of the forum was women strengthening trust and global cooperation and peace. I was also in St. Petersburg for the peace conference dedicated to nature cooperation in the Baltic Sea and the Arctic Sea. I also had meetings scheduled in Moscow at a university, and also meeting with the Institute for U.S. and Canadian Studies. So my intention in going to Russia was to participate in these high-level meetings that were dedicated to peace and cooperation, and also to make contacts with academics on learning more about Russia and the work that they're doing. And so I went because I was invited, and also because I want to learn more about Russia and find ways to end this current conflict in Ukraine, and to work cooperatively with Russia. So I was away for 2 weeks, and then I came back to Canada and was stopped at the Toronto International Airport.
Mm-hmm. And how did you, just briefly, Tamara, how did you come to decide that you were going to attend this conference? How did that all happen?
So I was invited to represent the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. I'm a member of 2 women's peace organizations, as you explained in your introduction, and I was invited to attend this Eurasian Women's Forum, to represent this Canadian women's groups at this high-level meeting that took place in St. Petersburg, Russia. And like I said, this was a high-level meeting, 2,000 women from 126 countries. There were foreign ministers, deputy foreign ministers, a big contingent of delegates from South Africa and India and China, women from all over, and coming together in the spirit of trying to work collaboratively on dealing with common challenges, and to learn from each other, and to share information. So I was invited from the Russian embassy in Canada, and the reason why our organization has this connection with the Russian embassy is because our women's organization sent letters to the Russian embassy, the Ukraine embassy, the U.S. embassy, and our government to ask for meetings over the past 2 years since this war in Ukraine has been raging. We've sent women's delegates to these embassies in Canada, asking for a meeting, and to express to them that we want the war to end. We want to try to find ways to peace. Now, the Ukraine embassy, the U.S. embassy, and our government have refused to meet with us. The Russian embassy has met with us a couple of times, so we've had women's delegates go to the Russian embassy, and to meet and exchange information. We were very clear with the Russian embassy that we're pacifist organization. We're opposed to all violence, so we don't support, the Russian military operation in Ukraine, and we want to try to find ways to end this war. We're also very much opposed to Canada's involvement in this war by sending weapons to Ukraine, prolonging this war. And we see this war in Ukraine as a NATO proxy war, and that was really started by the United States and Canada. And our organizations, in the past, during the Cold War, sent women's delegations to the USSR at the time in 1962 and then 1982. So it's in that spirit of trying to cross divides, to try to interact with our so-called adversary or enemy, that we wanted to reach out to all of the embassies to ask for meetings and to let them know we want to end the war. And it was the Russian embassy that it allowed us to come and have a meeting, and we've developed a relationship, like I said, over the past year and a half. And then we received in the springtime an invitation to attend the Eurasian Women's Forum, and it was I was personally invited as a representative of VOW, and I accepted the invitation and I went. And knowing that I was going to be going, I reached out to European friends in Russia to say, let's also create another conference on trying to build peace in the Baltic Sea and the Arctic Sea. So we developed a 2-day program in St. Petersburg. It was fantastic. And then I tried to just fill my schedule with meetings, reaching out to academics at St. Petersburg State University, at Moscow State University, because I'm an academic as well, and wanting to make connections with professors and students at these universities to learn more, because at my university, Wilfrid Laurier University, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, they are not having the Russian perspective. And I think it's just so critical for us to really understand a conflict, to hear from all sides. So I wanted to hear the Russian perspective because I want to find a way to end this war in Ukraine. And it's essential to listen to the other side. So I'm not, yeah.
I'd like to get into what happened at the airport. But before I do, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to say one thing before we do that. And that is, you said a moment ago that in your opinion, Canada, the United States and its allies effectively started this war. So I don't want to get into the whole history of this war. This is really a subject that should be debated. I'm sure you would agree with this, Tamara, based upon the historical record and evidence. And people may have a different view about how this war started, and that's fine. That doesn't mean they should be spied upon. It doesn't mean that they should be silenced. But I just want to say about that particular issue, if you have questions about why anyone like Tamara or me would say that the U.S. and its allies provoked this war, check out a recording of a conversation in 2014 between senior State Department official Victoria Nuland and the ambassador to Ukraine of the United States at the time, Jeffrey Pyatt, in which Miss Nuland can be heard choosing the next prime minister of Ukraine at a time when Viktor Yanukovych was still the elected and serving president of the country. And sure enough, this man, his name is Yatsenyuk. She refers to him in the conversation as Yats, and says, he's our guy. He did become the prime minister of Ukraine. And there's a whole bunch of other reasons out there why one could argue quite persuasively that there was a US and EU orchestrated coup in Ukraine in 2014. But the point here is whether or not you agree with it, there is historical evidence to back it up, and these should be issues that are discussed openly. If we don't discuss them openly, how are we going to bring to an end this war, which is first and foremost causing immense suffering to the Ukrainian people? So with that as background, Tamara, why don't you tell us what happened at Pearson International Airport this week, starting from the point in time where you entered the customs area?
So I should explain my itinerary that day. So I flew from Moscow to Istanbul. I had several hours in the airport, and then I flew from Istanbul to Toronto. Now, I should also say that in the past 2 years, I have flown at least in and out of the Toronto airport about 8 times. So from England, from Poland, from the United States, from the United Arab Emirates. So I have flown a number of times into that airport from other countries and have never experienced the situation that I experienced this time coming from Russia. So it was Wednesday, October 2nd. I was coming in from Istanbul, and there was, about 300 people on the plane. And, I was in the gate. There was extra security at the gate in Istanbul. So I was aware of the other people on the plane with me, people from Syria and from Libya and from other places in the Middle East, from Turkey. There was a great diversity of people on the plane. And we get off the plane, and then we get into the area where it's passport control. So this is where there's the terminals. You need to do your self-declaration. Are you bringing in any kind of goods that might be restricted? And so I filled out the self-declaration. I didn't have anything to declare. I had very few souvenirs that I brought with me from Russia. And then I went to passport control and showed my passport, showed my declaration slip that I had nothing to declare. And then I was exiting that area, and there was a border security sitting down and looking at people's white slips and just having people quickly walk through. But there was another agent there that kind of intercepted me and came right up to me and looked at my slip, and he said, where are you coming from? And I said, I'm coming from Istanbul. And he said, let me see your declaration. I showed it. He goes, where else have you come from today? Where else have you been today? And I said, well, I've also been in Moscow in Russia. And then he took my slip. He wrote the BIO on it, and I think that's border inspection, an extra level of inspection. Then he gave me back my slip, and he said, it's very interesting that you've been in Russia. What were you doing in Russia? And I said, well, I was attending a conference and I had some meetings. And he said, he goes, oh, Russia. Well, that's very interesting. And then he let me carry on to go to the luggage area where I collected my luggage. And there were so many passengers on this particular plane that there were two carousels used for the luggage. So I collected my belongings, and then I went to exit the luggage area, to exit the airport and carry on to go home. But the border security was waiting for me there. And when I went through with my slip and my luggage to leave, they said, no, you need to come in for extra screening. So then I was taken to this other area of the airport, a large room, secure, very securitized. It wasn't an open space. It was a closed space. There was probably about 6 booths where they could screen other passengers, but I was the only one that on this plane that I saw the entire time that I was there that was required to have a secondary screening. So at this point, the Canadian Border Services agent subjected me to a long line of questions. And then he, proceeded to look through all of my bags. And, once I had finished that very long process, and, was able to collect my luggage again, this is when a CSIS agent came out and said, we would like to talk to you. I would like to talk to you, and required me to go into a small room and talk with him.
And can you just did this CSIS agent this was a male agent, I understand? Is that correct? And,
yes.
And did he identify himself? If so, how did he do that?
Well, so I asked him who he was and if I could see any identification. So he said that his name was Jay. He flashed his badge. I asked if I could have his full name and his ID number. He said that I couldn't have that information. He asked me if I was recording the interview, and I said that I'm just about to turn on my phone to do that. And he said that I wasn't allowed to record the interview. I asked him if the room that I was in, because it was a small room that very well could have been have a recording equipment in it. And I asked if I was being recorded, and he said that I wasn't being recorded. And so then he was just very curious about why I was in Russia, and it was the reason that I had gone to Russia that was why I was examined extra by the security official, and why I was asked to have this interview with CSIS officers.
Before we get into, and I'm very interested in knowing what kinds of particular questions he asked you, but before we get into that, he told you, as I understand, a number of things about his prior knowledge of your activities. Could you tell us about This is I think is really troubling, in particular when one considers the limits on CSIS's ability to spy on Canadians. Can you tell us about what he said to you in regard to his prior surveillance of your activities?
Yeah, so he began the conversation by saying that I was well known. I was well known to the government, to his agency, and I was, well known in the community. He said that he was a CSIS officer responsible for Southwestern Ontario. He said that he was aware that I moved around in the area, doing presentations. He said that he had followed some of the presentations and activities that I was involved in, and and he made it seem that either he himself or other CSIS agents had been attending events that where I've done a number of speaking engagements and presentations at different universities and community centers across Ontario, and it gave me the impression that they had attended some of those events. And as well, he was following me, or CSIS was following my activity on social media as well. So I was aware of interviews and presentations that I had done online. And I also, I found that, very troubling. I mean, he was trying to and quite intimidating, like, being it's very unsettling, listening to a CSIS agent say that they're monitoring your activity. And
We're spying on you. He was telling
yeah,
you we've been spying on you for years. In a nutshell, isn't that essentially what he was telling you?
yeah,
Yeah.
and I said to him, things like, uh, um, I that if you have been following my activity for so long, then you're well aware of the fact that I'm a dedicated peace activist, that I'm a mother, that I'm an environmentalist, that I care very much about trying to make the world a better place, that I care very much about ending war and having peace in the world so that people aren't suffering. And then the other thing uh, that was also disconcerting to hear was that he told me that CSIS had been preparing for my arrival at the airport. So they knew in advance that I was, coming home on October 2nd, that they were organizing to have a CSIS agent in place to meet me at the airport to interview me. This wasn't something that was like a last minute, um, episode that they just happened to realize a passenger was coming off of a plane in Turkey, had some connection to Russia, and they needed to interview this person or find out exactly what was going on. No, this was something that they knew, perhaps days ahead, and they were getting an agent in place. So this is something else that he revealed, that they were getting an agent in place, to meet me at the airport. And he said that, CSIS was trying to find an agent that day that was available. And because he was aware of me and my activities, even though his schedule had finished earlier in the day, he wanted to meet me at the airport. And so he extended his shift to, return to the airport and to meet with me. So, CSIS was making an extra effort to interview me at the airport, and and it was primarily because of Russia.
And before we get to the questions he asked you, two things. First of all, I think in the course of when you first explained to me what had happened before this interview, I understand that in the course of him telling you that they prepared to receive you at the airport, shall we say, they looked at flight logs. What exactly did he say about that?
Yeah, so he said that CSIS receives the flight logs, and from planes that are coming into the country, and scrutinizes them, is looking at where Canadians have gone, what their itineraries are. And he said border security said that my itinerary was interesting because, I had been to Russia. And I guess at this point, it's also important to note that Global Affairs Canada has a travel advisory against going to Russia. So if you were to look at Global Affairs right now and look at what it says about traveling to Russia, it's recommending to Canadians, not to go to Russia. And
but there's no, to be clear, there's no legal prohibition on traveling.
There's no legal prohibition, but they don't want Canadians to go, and they are making it difficult to go. Dimitri, we're in a hybrid war with Russia. In economic, we've got the most sanctions ever against a country, against Russia. Information war against Russia. All of these things. So they're making it very difficult for Canadians to learn about Russia, to go to Russia, to try to understand this war in Ukraine. And so the roadblocks that the Canadian government is putting in place to try to make it more difficult for Canadians to really understand what's going on, to try to go to Russia, to learn the Russian perspective, about this conflict. It is something that Canadians need to be aware of. But I also feel very strongly about trying to supersede and trying to go myself to understand what's going on. I think it's important for Canadians to go to places, to do their own fact-finding missions, and to educate themselves about other countries so that they can make more informed decisions about our international affairs.
Yeah, and Tamara, as I'm sure you well know, most Canadians can't travel to countries like Russia just because of the financial constraints or the demands of their jobs, their family lives. You are fortunately one of the persons in this country who's privileged to be able to travel, as am I, to these countries. And so because most Canadians are really not practically able to make these trips to places far afield like Russia, particularly when they're being discouraged by the government to even go there, it's all the more important that those of us who can make those trips establish some relationship with the Russian people, not just the Russian people, the Chinese people, all the peoples of this world whose countries are alleged to be hostile to us, and create some dialogue and share with our fellow Canadians, those who can't go, what we learn when we interact directly with these people from these countries in their own homeland. Now, before we get into the questions he asked you, I also wanted to just make sure our audience was aware about something he said about your address.
So in the course of our conversation, I was expressing my concerns and criticisms of CSIS, and in order to derail me, to kind of interrupt the conversation, he just all of a sudden, out of the blue, said across the table to me, looking in my eyes, said, "Are you still living?" And he said my address. And I was really taken aback. I found this very shocking and disturbing that he would just say my exact address back to me. And so, he knew exactly where I lived, and it made me think, has he driven, or a CSIS agent driven by my house? Are they sometimes maybe surveilling my house? Like, it was very unsettling to just have a CSIS agent say exactly where you live right out of the blue. It didn't come, for instance, at the beginning of the conversation where he was trying to go over my personal details or something like that. He just interjected in the conversation. So I found it very intimidating. I found other things that were said and done in the interview intimidating and troubling. And
okay. So why don't you tell us the types of questions, whether they were intimidating or not, that he asked you? Why was he, what did he try to learn from you in the course of this questioning?
So he, wanted to know more information about my work, about my studies, about my traveling, about why I was going to Russia. I tried to give, to give the least amount of information, necessary. And like I said, I was, more concerned about trying to let CSIS know that I was very upset with their activities, because I think that CSIS, like I said, is really not a very good intelligence service, and really just reproducing American intelligence, and engaging in activities that I don't think that it should be. I said to him a couple of times, why are you wasting your time talking to a peace activist, a mother, a Canadian citizen who is really committed to peace and justice and disarmament, ending war, and not concerned about, and not spending more time in trying to deal with people who want to inflict violence or who are real security threats to Canada. Me being a peace activist is not a threat to Canada. And yeah, so I just felt that, me being subjected to this questioning was really inappropriate, and just like a complete waste of Canadian tax dollars, and the resources of our federal government, doing this.
Yeah. So what's very interesting to me, Tamara, is that on September 23rd, so this would have been, a few days before you returned from Russia to Canada, there was an op-ed published by the Hill Times, which is based in Ottawa. And for people who don't know, the Hill Times is essentially the go-to newspaper of Canada's political elite. It's not only based in the capital of the country, but it is entirely focused on politics in Canada, politicians, the activities of the government, who the most influential lobbyists are, and so forth. And it's widely read, not only by politicians, but by their staffers and by people who are in the lobbying industry. This op-ed, which appeared on September 23rd, was entitled "Holding the Kremlin's Canadian Influencers to Account." And it was authored by two Canadian senators, Stanley Couture and Senator Pamela Wallin. I think it's fair to say that both of them are of a neoconservative orientation, which is to say that they very much view China and Russia as being some sort of existential threat to the West, and undoubtedly very supportive of Canada's policies with respect to NATO, with respect to the Ukraine war, with respect to what is happening, the horrors being visited upon the peoples of West Asia by Israel and its Western backers. And the third author of this article was a character by the name of Marcus Kolga. We're going to come back to him in just a second. I just want to quote from a paragraph from this article, which, by the way, is behind a paywall, unfortunately, but I'm going to put a link to it in the description to this video. And the paragraph that they wrote is this: "It's no surprise that Canadian far-right and far-left extremists are involved in Kremlin information operations. After all, far-left activists and academics from this country have routinely appeared on RT and collaborate with Russian think tanks. However, the central role played by Canadians in this operation underscores a dangerous vulnerability. Our failure to deter such activities has exposed our democracy to well-orchestrated and well-funded ongoing manipulation. The $10 million uncovered likely represents just a small fraction of a much larger Kremlin operation." And just pausing there, what they're talking about, which I've covered in a prior report or two, are allegations by the U.S. State Department that RT, the state broadcaster in Russia, is working with Russian intelligence, and there's some allegation around a payment that it's said to have made to some company to help it distribute disinformation, a $10 million payment. None of these allegations has been proven in court, but the op-ed that appeared in the Hill Times assumes that all of it is true, notwithstanding, the U.S. government's record of flagrant lying. Nonetheless, I'm just going to finish reading from this paragraph because it's the key part of the paragraph. Canadian authorities must swiftly and fully investigate these activities, as well as the broader web of academics, activists, and columnists who engage with Russian state media and think tanks on behalf of Russia. Now, Marcus Kolga he's a senior fellow at a think tank, as you well know, Tamara, called the McDonald-Laurier Institute. He also runs some outfit called Disinfo Watch. It's a very shady outfit. It's very difficult to know who's behind that outfit, how it's funded, and so forth. And he presents himself, even though he just has a BA in political science from the University of Illinois, and I'm not knocking degrees in political science. I think these are very important areas of study. But he claims to be an expert in disinformation, although that's, as far as I can tell, the only post-secondary education he has. So just a degree in political science. I myself don't think you're an expert in disinformation because you get a degree in political science, but hey, what do I know? In any event, what can you tell us about this institute, the McDonald-Laurier Institute, and particularly, what did you learn in the course of your efforts to find out who's funding this organization?
So that's a lot, Dimitri. So Marcus Kolga's program, Disinformation Watch, is a program that's under the McDonald-Laurier Institute, and this is a conservative, a right-wing think tank that has a very pro-military, like pro-U.S., pro-corporate agenda, and it does a lot of activities, right? It's got a lot of op-eds in the newspapers. It's hosting a lot of events and webinars, and doing lots of campaigning and lobbying on Parliament Hill. And so, several times over the past few years, I have sent email requests, asking them about their funding, because you can't find information about who exactly is funding the McDonald-Laurier Institute. And, I'm very suspicious because it's this militaristic corporatist agenda, and that's very well resourced because they're able to do a lot of activity, and they are having a tremendous impact in shaping our public policy and influencing our government. And I would like to find out more, who is funding them. And but they've refused to give me and you a list of who is funding them. And so, we can't find that information, even though, we've asked for it. And I think that there should be transparency, about this organization. But then on Marcus Kolga's program, Disinformation Watch, if you go to that website and you were to go to the link about, and you will see that Disinformation Watch is actually funded by the U.S. government, the U.S. Embassy in Canada, and it's also funded by the European Union and NATO Strategic Communications. So this is a program that is very much controlled by, funded by the U.S. government, by the European Union, and by NATO. And of course, Disinformation Watch has a very anti-Russia perspective and a pro-NATO, pro-US, pro-military perspective. And Marcus Kolga is, regularly in the media. But the other thing that's so troubling is that Global Affairs Canada, and this is being retweeted out, reshared by National Defense and by CSIS, Marcus Kolga is being used by Global Affairs. There are posts that Global Affairs has created, interviewing Marcus Kolga, and he's expressing, anti Russia sentiments, and and so he's working very closely, with our government, with NATO strategic communications, with the U.S. government. And when you look at media reports that he's in the newspaper or on television, they'll just say Marcus Kolga from Disinfo Watch, McDonald Laurier Institute, but they'll never say that it's funded by the U.S. government. It's funded by NATO strategic communications, and this is something that Canadians should be aware of.
Yeah. In other words, at least this is in my view, please feel free to disagree with me, that this so-called disinformation expert is a purveyor of disinformation. Would you agree with that statement?
Dimitri, I would absolutely agree with that. And what's really important to know is that in the spring of 2023, Kolga released a report called The Enemy of My Enemy, and a report about Russian disinformation on the war in Ukraine. And what he claims in that report is disinformation is if you say something like NATO expansion is one of the causes of this war in Ukraine, he says that is disinformation. But that's not truthful. That's not accurate. I actually went to the Clinton Presidential Archives in Little Rock, Arkansas last October. I spent a week there looking at records. It is clear in the records. If you look at private archives, if you look at the national security archives that are public, you can see definitively that the Russians for 30 years have been opposed to NATO expansion, particularly NATO expansion to Ukraine. And they said that, that was the red line. There's a plethora of evidence to make the claim that NATO expansion is one of the causes for this war in Ukraine. So it's not disinformation, as he says. And then other things like he says in it is if you say that, for instance, Ukraine is corrupt, that's disinformation. But then again, here, that's not truthful. In September of 2021, the EU auditors did an extensive study of Ukraine to determine whether or not it was ready to join the European Union. And what did the EU auditors find in their 200-page report? That Ukraine in September of 2021 was plagued with grand corruption, the worst level of corruption, right? This was just a few months before Russia invaded. So to make the claim that Ukraine is suffering with corruption is accurate. It's not disinformation. And so there's a whole bunch of other things that are in this report. So what he's trying to do with this report and in his work is trying to is to narrow the debate, is to control the narrative of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And then if we can just go back, to make the links between Marcus Kolga and my CSIS interview, what Disinformation Watch and Kolga says is that the far right and the far left, so people who are criticizing on the far right, like the Republicans in the United States that are opposed to the war in Ukraine, and the people on the left, like you and me, who want this war in Ukraine to end, who know about U.S. involvement in the coup, the U.S. arming Nazi militias in Ukraine. And so what Kolga and his Disinformation Watch are saying is that the far right and the far left are spewing disinformation. They're not accurate, and he is trying to control the narrative. And he's doing this in conjunction with the Canadian government, and this should raise alarms for Canadians. And then how it links to my interview with CSIS is that CSIS was saying that the CSIS agent was saying to me when I said, "Why are you bothering to just to monitor peace activists?" And he said, "Well, I'm also monitoring the far right." So he's doing this dirty work, right, of disinformation watch, and you're monitoring the far left and the far right. And so, this is a huge problem.
Yeah, clearly Kolga is trying to stigmatize anybody who disagrees with him about Ukraine or just Russia and China generally as extremists. So people won't listen to them; they'll think they're kooks. But just to be clear, again, my own view is if you are constantly, advocating aggressively for policies that are increasing tensions with nuclear-armed states, constantly arguing for more and more money to be sunk down the military-industrial toilet when we have so many other needs, I would say you're the extremist. Now, before we close it out, Tamara, I just want to say another word about the McDonald-Laurier Institute, and that is, as Tamara indicated, both she and I tried to get information about their funders, and they used to disclose for a number of years, at least, limited information about their major donors. And then the policy changed around 2021, and their annual report, where that information appeared annually, just contained a statement said that they would issue donor information upon request. So Tamara and I made these requests a couple of years ago, and then after initially being told they were going to give us the information, they suddenly changed the policy. And the new policy was, we're not going to disclose this information to the public at all. But I did go through the prior annual reports and discovered, just to elaborate upon what you said, Tamara, that amongst the funders that they had identified in prior years, they included the Embassy of Ukraine, the Embassy of Latvia and Canada, the Embassy of the United States, the Ministry of Defense of Latvia, and Latvia, of course, is a country that's intensely hostile to Russia, the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Canada, the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. Then there's a whole bunch of major corporations, particularly from the fossil fuels industry. And they also took money from Lockheed Martin, the Canadian subsidiary of Lockheed Martin, and a military industrial company called Lodestar Security Services. So these were in prior years. I will put a link to that, an article on my website, which has much more information about McDonald-Laurier's prior disclosures about its sources of funding. But the bottom line is this: there is lots of reason to think that this organization, which is constantly squawking about alleged foreign interference in Canadian politics, and which is so influential in the public discourse, is itself being funded, and through the funding, influenced and perhaps even controlled by foreign governments. So do you have anything else to add before we sign off, Tamara?
Well, you mentioned that Lockheed Martin was a funder in the past of the McDonald-Laurier Institute, and it's really important to be aware of the fact that these big U.S. weapons manufacturers, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, are also funding other prominent think tanks in this country that have tremendous amount of influence on our foreign policy, our defense policy, and this rising military spending. So, Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics are the prime funders of the NATO Association of Canada. Their headquarters are in Toronto. They're also major funders for the Conference of Defense Association Institute, and they're the funders for the Canadian Global Affairs Institute as well. And these are the think tanks that are often quoted in the media, but the media, for instance, the CBC, will never reveal to Canadians that these think tanks are funded by the American weapons manufacturers. So it's really in their interest, right, to keep this war in Ukraine going. They're making a lot of profit from all of the weapons that are being manufactured and used. And it's people like yourself, Dimitri, and myself that, I worked really hard before in 2021 to try to prevent this conflict in Ukraine escalating into a war, and working really hard to try to end it so that there isn't the suffering of Ukrainians and Russians. People are being injured and being killed by these weapons that we're making in Canada and that we're exporting. And so if we really care about Ukraine, we need to end this war. And if we really care about a democratic honest discourse in this country. We need to be transparent about who is funding the think tanks, and we also need to hear all perspectives. We need to hear all perspectives in order to get to the root causes of these conflicts and to end them.
Hear, hear. And before we sign off, I should also mention that Lockheed Martin is a major advertiser in the Hill Times, which published this McCarthyite op-ed by Kolga and Company. In any event, thank you very much, Tamara, for joining me today. It's been a pleasure as always. And this is Dimitri Lascaris and Tamara Lorincz coming to you on October 5th, 2024.